Welcome to the Endurance Drive podcast.
Our mission is to share the key principles that structure our approach to endurance training and coaching.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Katie.
Hey, here we are. Celebration episode.
Yeah, this is a big celebration for a whole lot of reasons, including, Jim, you're back on the bike. It's a big deal.
It's a big deal. Yeah, I think just past 6 weeks from surgery, back on the snow bike, and yesterday got back on the gravel bike. So feeling fantastic, feeling very grateful to be back on the roads, and mostly just looking forward to being back with bike rides with people.
Yeah, I bet. And was it weird to be back? Like, did it feel natural, or how was your mindset as you got back on the bike?
Yeah, it was really interesting. The first minute was really, really awkward and felt very, very strange, especially on the gravel bike. But it's interesting going from minute 1 to minute 90. Minute 90 felt like, oh, I'm kind of back. Although kind of interesting is that with this injury is that I have a lot more pressure like on my seat. And so it's a little bit harder to sit sometimes. And so because there's less pressure in the pedals, so find myself having to sit up quite a bit and get used to the bike saddle again.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I feel like for any of us, even without an injury, when you spend some time off the bike saddle and get back on, it's like, oh, wow, this is something different. But I'm sure, especially for you.
It's way different. And for you, you got a big thing coming up.
Yeah, well, when this episode airs, hopefully I will have made it through my PhD graduation. So I guess that's my celebration item of the week. But yeah, excited to have that behind me. And maybe later in the episode, we'll talk a little bit about what I have coming up next, because I think it's related to our topic. But before we do that, I think we have to celebrate the biggest thing of the day, which is we're coming up on 6 months of the podcast and 35 episodes, which is crazy. I mean, in the beginning, we were like, will we do 3? Will we do 10? Is this ever going to go anywhere? And now I feel like it's just entered into our kind of routine of how we do things at the Endurance Drive.
Yeah, congratulations. And you've been here for all of them. And I was just saying before the podcast came on, I don't know how you do this every week, because I just feel less prepared, because this is the episode we did, Lake Placid episode, and we're doing this episode back to back. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I usually have 2 weeks to think about these things. So congratulations to you and for all the podcasts. And boy, how do you do it every week? I don't know.
I put my head down like we do when we're riding and just get it done, because the fastest way is through, as we always say. So
Right. Exactly.
A lot of podcast lessons. And speaking of that, we decided that for this 6th-month episode, we were going to go into some lessons. So our episode 5, I believe, at the end of 2023, just when we started off the podcast, we did an episode called Lessons from 2023. And we kind of just reflected on all the things that we picked up from training and coaching in that year. And I feel like since then, we've picked up some more lessons, and we don't want to wait all the way until the end of 2024 to share them, because then it'll be like a 6-hour episode, which I don't know if people are into that. We're sort of capping out at that hour, 5 minutes mark. So here we're going to share some lessons that we've picked up from training, from coaching, and maybe even from podcasting, because there's some super interesting stuff there.
Absolutely. But, first, should we start with was this our favorite topic, the coaching and training insights?
I feel like every week we're not sure if it's gear or coaching and training insights, but we like both. It's nice to have a nice sandwich where like the bread is really nice and the meat is just whatever it is. But yeah, we love that good bread.
That's a great analogy. Great. Yeah. Well, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Okay. So my first coaching and training insight is all about the idea of keeping some level of joy and actual humor in the way we think about training. And I think it's so easy to get really wrapped up in like, oh my gosh, my A race is the most serious thing that I've ever done. And I've had a lot of athletes doing their races and having pre-race calls. And I had a pre-race call with one of my athletes recently. So shout out to Gigi's pre-race call. She was racing her first 70.3 at Western Mass. She did great. And I've always loved how she just brings a lot of humor and levity to things that are serious and do matter, but in a way that's just takes a little bit of the pressure off. So she was telling me that, as the race goes on, she had experienced this in a race sim. She experiences this in long efforts. She'll always reach this point where she's really feeling it, where she's really tired. And the way that she described that feeling was to quote from the movie Holes. So in the movie Holes, there's this beginning scene where the little girl is like digging a hole and she goes, "I'm tired of this, Grandpa." And then the grandpa says, "Well, that's too damn bad." And so Gigi says, everyone will reach that "I'm tired of this, Grandpa" feeling. And I'm just sitting on this call laughing, thinking about like how down in the dumps you're going to be at the end of like, for example, a really long bike ride. You don't want to be out there. And just saying to yourself, like, "I'm tired of this, Grandpa," it brings a little bit of levity to something that is not so fun, but reminds us that, maybe laughing and smiling can really, really help. And then she also said, when you get this feeling, it's a good idea to eat a Snickers because you're not you when you're hungry, which is great. Like if you're having a tough time, fuel. So yeah, just shout out to Gigi. And this also reminded me of a quote that I saw on Instagram. Taylor Nibb, who's an incredible triathlete. She just won the T100 in San Francisco, and I believe she's headed to the Olympics soon. She had a quote about her race, and she said, "I was reading Rick Rubin's The Creative Act, A Way of Being on the plane to San Francisco. In his area of thought on play," he writes, "we embrace both the seriousness of the commitment and the playfulness of being completely free in the making, taking it seriously without going about it in a serious way." And I love this, the idea that, you can take something really, really seriously without being a serious person about it. And as someone who, when I am racing, I get very serious and have trouble kind of infusing that play and humor, I'm going to really try to do that going forward because I thought it was such a powerful insight.
Yeah, that's so great. I've always loved that phrase, like you can be serious without being a serious person. And I think that sort of characterizes actually both of us. Is I think we're both kind of serious about what we do, but also can make sure it's play and fun in there as well too. And actually, it's sort of a aside here, I actually watched the San Francisco T100 coverage the other day, and it's outstanding coverage. So I think our friends over at Ironman have a little bit to learn from the TV production value of the T100 series.
Totally. I mean, we could have a whole episode on just like this growing spectator sport of triathlon, but T100 has totally nailed it. So watch out, Ironman, because they're totally coming for you. So my next insight, I just have one more today. And this is something that has also come up in my pre-race communication with a lot of my athletes. I think it is really, really important to make sure that you're dialing in your watch and bike computer settings, not the night before the race. And I found that a lot of people, they're used to doing their race sims just with the separate swim and bike and run functionality that they're used to. But then they get into race day and they know that, their transition is only going to be 2 or 3 minutes long compared to their 15-minute transition otherwise. And they're like, oh, I want to use triathlon mode. And then they have no idea how it works, no idea what data is going to appear on the watch. And I'm like on FaceTime with them at 9:00 the night before the race, trying to be like, okay, use that button, try this out. That is not something that we want to happen. So right now, if you have a race coming up in a month, in 2 months, start playing with your watch and figuring out how that mode works. Use it in race sims. That also gives you a little bit of an incentive to make your transitions faster. But I think watch settings is something that you don't want to be frustrating you or a challenge on race day. And if you get out there and you realize, oh, wow, I can't even see my heart rate. I have no idea where I'm at because it's not showing up on my triathlon bike watch screen, that's going to be a problem. So just be aware of what those screens are, change them as necessary, and get prepared.
Do you use triathlon mode in races?
Yeah, I do. Do you?
Okay. No, I don't have the brain space for it. So I really don't. Every time I've tried to use it, I think it's a great feature, but every time I try to use it, I forget to hit the button when I'm running into T1. So I'll just do a swim as a swim. And then I have a bike computer as well too. And of course I use the bike computer for my biking. And then when I get to T2, I'll just draw on a run. So I find that method for me is better because I'll have to really think of it. Like I think of like when I'm going to go for a run, like, oh, I'm thinking about my Garmin in run mode. But it's way too complicated for me.
Okay, well, that's actually a good piece of advice here is whatever method you want to use, figure it out beforehand. So if you have a method that works, like I use triathlon watch mode because I know how it works. But if you've never used it before and you have a process that works, I would probably just use that on race day and get really used to your preferred process. All right, Jim, on to you, coaching and training insights.
Okay, great. So speaking of sort of being unprepared, I'm going to sort of talk through this one with you and we can figure it out. But I wrote this formula this week and I'll say what it is and then I'll try to explain it. But I said training plus fuel equals performance. And then the next equation is training plus fuel plus performance equals racing. And kind of how I came about this was I was talking to an athlete and they had just done an Olympic distance race and they had said, I really felt like I was racing. I really figured out where the edge was on the bike and I knew what matches I could burn. And he was basically describing like, actually racing. And he's just done enough triathlons now to kind of know like where the limit is, what he can do, what he can't do. And I thought that's so different than say like a race sim or even just like training. So like, we go out there on a training day or maybe on a race sim day, and even on some of the first races that we do, we're not really kind of racing, but then you sort of take all that together, the training and the fueling and the performance again being like just some experience there. And I don't know if that makes any sense, but I just sort of like, I wrote these formulas out and I'm like, I don't know, this kind of makes sense to me, but I don't know if it makes sense to anybody else.
No, I think I like this. And I think the idea of performance when we're capturing here, obviously it's going to come from training, obviously it's going to come from fueling, but there's this intangible kind of experience. And it's not even course experience. It's just getting out there and knowing like, is this sustainable? Is this not sustainable? Can I listen to my body? I think for me, that performance piece is this edge that I have in racing that I can't always replicate in a race sim. So I always tend to pull out these performances that I wouldn't write down on paper. I can definitely do this. And maybe not always. I have definitely had bad races too. But in that A race, I can often tap into this gear that I think comes from whatever this nebulous performance idea is. So maybe the lesson here for our athletes is like, the way to get better at racing is to race a lot. And so if you do a 5K run, you're going to learn a bunch of things about racing that will help you for your half Ironman. It doesn't mean you need to do 6 half Ironmans before your A race, but in general, you want to nail the training, you want to nail the fueling, but it's a little bit less straightforward to nail the performance unless you're practicing it.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks for helping me flush that one out. and my next one we can help flush out as well too. So I heard this concept this week from some coaches that I listened to on a podcast, and it was talking about relational. And so the point of being here is that training is both this physical and mental and relational act. And first of all, I had to kind of look up like what relational meant. And so here it's like concerning the way in which 2 or more people or things are connected. And I know we've sort of talked about this before in this podcast of having a support network, but I was thinking about relational just in terms of like your location, how easy it is to train, your peer group, who's around you, and like also your support network. And so this idea that you can have the physical and mental capacity to train, but it really helps to have this like low friction training universe. And I think a good example of this that we see, Katie, is with the Dartmouth Tri Club, where the entire practice schedule and programming is really accessible to everybody. There's multiple practices per day. And more importantly, there's just tons of people to practice with. And then when we see people graduate, they have the same physical and mental skills that they have as an undergraduate, but they don't always have this relational part it's sort of no longer there. And then you can see these folks sort of struggling and saying, do I still want to race? Do I still want to do triathlon? Because they're just not related anymore to, 2 or more things. And I just thought that was kind of an interesting observation. And so I think this is another way for us of saying, like, we endorse, like, for our masters athletes is to do master swims and do more group rides and do more group runs, because they do provide that like relational part of your training program.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think this hits so many themes that we care about. One of them is community. That matters a lot. And then even just like maybe a sense of place. I think you can be relational in talking about your space. So when we travel, it's really stressful, not necessarily because it's impossible to train when we travel, but because we don't know where the pool is and what the pool hours are. And like, do you need a day pass? And how does it all work? There's so many things that, you don't have the same relation to a place. And if we think about our students who graduate, like it's a brand new, they're moving to a city and it's harder, and you can't roll out the door on your bike and bike for 500 miles without hitting a single traffic light, except in the town of Hanover. Like, so many things change. So it's nice. I mean, we think about keeping things simple and relational. I think you want to stay simple in relation to the place that you're training, and then figure out who your crew is, who your support network is, and try to tap into that. Because that, I think, also just keeps the joy in what you're doing beyond the physical and mental components.
Yep, absolutely. All right. So that's all I had for training insights this week. Should we move on to the main topic?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. We didn't do too many insights this week because I feel like this episode we could just rebrand as like extended insights for the whole episode. But I do think the ones that we're going to talk about here are a little bit more meta. So as an outline, let's go back and forth. We're going to start with training lessons. Then we're going to go to coaching lessons. Then we're going to go to podcasting lessons. And we'll maybe sprinkle in some life lessons throughout there. And then we'll close with our favorite finishing segment. But I think I'm going to kick us off with training lessons. And this should come as a surprise to no one because I feel like I've talked about it on every single podcast. But I am going to stand on my strength training soapbox for 2024. So this was a change for me in that I have sort of strength trained in some disorganized way in the past. But this year I started working with a strength trainer, as I have said. And a few things that I specifically changed with this strength training routine was I followed an actual progressive overload program. So believe it or not, I was not doing the exact same weight every single week forever and ever. It was like, okay, I'm deadlifting this much. Now I can go 5 pounds up, 10 pounds up. And then you do a recovery week after 3 weeks of building. So that was really cool. Related to that was very, very intentional about doing deload weeks. So take 3 steps up and 1 step down. We do that a lot with our endurance training, but I tried to line these things up. So I was taking a deload week from strength in addition to my endurance. And then I was doing a lot of pretty cool fitness testing and benchmarking over time to actually see, like, am I making progress here? The amount of push-ups that I can do in a given time or how long I can hold a plank, all of that is changing. I was checking in with my strength trainer every, I think, 8 to 12 weeks to see what changes were happening. And I did experience a lot of changes. So what I felt that is related to endurance training is I saw some bigger breakthroughs in running, especially this year. And again, I was not following like a powerlifting program where I'm trying to figure out how much I can bench. That's not that useful for me as a runner. But doing all these strength exercises that are designed to improve my running and specifically my trail running and uphill capacity, I found that that was really, really happening. So I've just felt awesome with running recently. And I also feel probably the same or better at biking and swimming with honestly a lot less volume than last year. So that's what's really cool is at the end of the day, like we can put massive amounts of endurance volume, but if you already have a really good base, you can get a little bit more edge, I think, from building muscle. So that was really cool. And I think for now, I've been in this plan where I'm really, really gearing towards Sea to Summit and all my strength is centered around that. But later in the year, I'm looking forward to having like a really serious strength block that I've like said I did in the past, but was lifting the same every single week and not actually doing anything useful. So I'm excited to see where that goes. And maybe then I'll be able to hit even bigger goals next year with strength training.
So this begs a question, like, so how many push-ups can you do?
That is a confidentiality question between me and my strength trainers. You could ask her. But I can do a whole lot more than when I started too, because I could do very, very few in the beginning.
Do you find it's very empowering just sort of overall? Like, do you see like these gains kind of on a weekly basis and you go, oh my gosh, I really am getting stronger? I think sometimes with all this endurance training, it's like, another ride. You don't necessarily see like a breakthrough or a zone 2 run. But I think with strength, a lot of times like, wow, I see some pretty immediate changes. Were you experiencing the same thing?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think this is actually something I see with athletes too. For example, if we get a runner who's never done biking or swimming before and they come to us, they see some pretty quick gains from, oh, wow, like I was really flailing around in the pool and now I can swim at 25 without stopping. And for me, I've been swimming and biking and running for so long that this was just a new stimulus. So in general, I think, if you're a runner that's listening, try something new. Or if you're a triathlete that's listening, there's a steep learning curve, but it's nice to try something different. And I think with strength specifically, there's this like tangible, hey, I could lift this much before and now I can lift that much more. That's really, really cool. I can do a sled push with 20 more pounds than I could 4 weeks ago. Like that's cool to see because it's so tangible, I guess. And so, yeah, if you're someone who likes to be able to look at numbers and say, wow, I am better than I was before, then you got to try strength training.
Yeah, as triathletes and runners, like, as endurance athletes, we love our data. So this is a chance to really dive into it and see some improvement. So, and I love this. Yeah, it's like you can just never be too strong. And I'm super excited that you're doing this. Like you say, it's fun to be better at a sport, even maybe when you're doing less of it.
Mm-hmm, totally. So on the strength training soapbox, and I'm never getting off it. So that's where we are. But I'll get off it temporarily now so I can talk about my next lesson from 2024. So I'm going to call this fear of flying too close to the sun. And this is something that I experienced actually last year and then started to experience again this year. And so I now actually have some data to back it up for what this phenomenon is. But something I sometimes struggle with is when I feel like my training is going really, really well, I do get some level of anxiety about it. Like this feels too good to be true. Am I flying too close to the sun? It's like an Icarus moment where I'm getting a little bit cocky about like everything feels really, really good. And maybe this is just like my anxious brain doing its anxious thing. But in general, I think often that feeling does precede maybe like some type of niggle coming on or something happening that can set you back. Because again, at the end of the day, you don't want to peak too early for an A race. You don't want to feel 8 weeks out like you're the fittest you've ever been because you want to feel that way when you're going into your race. So I think a couple of things I've done, I started to experience that this year where I was kind of having a calf niggle come on and it really scared me, even though it wasn't that bad because I felt like I was doing really, really well. So I think a lesson that I took from this was if you feel like you're having a training breakthrough, the best thing to do is actually take a step back, which is so hard to do. And this is something that I think we've probably talked about from Alan Cousins. There's coaches out there that really preach this, but as soon as you have a workout where you're like, oh my gosh, I blew myself away with what I could do, that doesn't mean go harder the next day. That means it's probably time to take a recovery week. And if you do that, you'll actually soar higher than you thought, which is really, really cool. And then a second lesson for me was I cannot mess around with recovery weeks. So I was looking at my training last year as compared to this year. And it's funny because the Strava memories that show you your stuff from last year actually should show like a really interesting window to where things were at. So I was reminded on Strava about this time last year. I was really doing super well at the training, but was starting to have like a foot niggle come on, different things were happening, and I was worried about flying too close to the sun. And I saw that I'd uploaded some rides that I was labeling as a recovery week. And the only reason I labeled them as a recovery week was because I was on my road bike instead of my TT bike. But like, you made me put in like 12 hours of bike volume in a week that I had labeled as a recovery week. And so looking at that, I was like, okay, that was a red flag. And I did, have a moment last year where things kind of went off the rails for a variety of reasons. But looking at that and now saying like, no, actually, I'm going to cap my training at 10 hours or 11 hours for this recovery week when I'm doing, 15 to 17 hours the other weeks. That was a good reminder. And I'm glad to be able to look back on that and be like, that was a dumb thing that you did. Come on, like try again, Katie. Not so great here. And during those weeks, just make sleep your biggest priority, make fuel your biggest priority. You can't do it during a high LSS week, which was another mistake I made. And all of these things, I think, have helped me avoid flying too close to the sun as I continue to get ready.
So you were saying 12 hours a week on the bike is not recovery for a triathlete?
No, it's not for a triathlete. That's a peak week for a triathlete, even if you're on a road bike. So major crazy insight that I had.
Exactly. No, this is great. One thing I've been talking about a lesser extent is, coming back from injury and deciding on a regular basis, like what's appropriate and what's too much. And, this week I wanted to do some climbing on my fat bike and went up a big long hill and was then going to go down the other side of the hill and climb back up it and try to get 1,000 feet of climbing. And then I realized I got to the top of the hill and I'm like, wait a minute, like this is probably good enough. And if I feel good, I can come back in a couple of days and do this full climb. So there's a whole point of like always leaving one interval or like one bullet in the chamber. And we always talk about this, like never do something today or this week that will jeopardize like tomorrow.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, this, even when we tell people on track workouts, you should finish that last rep and feel like if we said you had to do one more, you could do one more. You never want to be like on the ground, you would die if you did one more. So that's kind of the way to think about meta training as well.
Yeah, it's funny because it's always this, debate in my head, like I could do it. But then when I don't do it, I always kind of feel like a baller. I'm like, yeah, like I had the maturity not to do that. I sort of like swagger back to the car, or the house, like, I'm a real professional.
Yeah. I mean, as we say, as coaches, our biggest job is holding people back. So when we actually exercise restraint, it's like also a nice pat on the back because it's hard. Newsflash, it is hard for us as coaches too sometimes to hold back when we're all like just trying to hit those goals.
Yeah.
So next one here, I think I actually saw in your notes that you're going to come back to this theme, Jim, but the theme is the idea of minimum effective dose. And I'm going to talk about swimming, my favorite sport in the entire world, as everybody in this podcast knows. Just kidding, it's not. But this year, I decided that because I don't really like swimming and because my A race has only a 2,100 yard swim, I decided that I was not ever going to swim more than 2 times per week, which seemed like a sustainable amount for me. Sometimes I got 1. There was one single week where I got 3. So that was a huge celebration. But I think that I was surprised to see that actually that seemed to be the minimum effective dose and that it's been working. So I've been doing basically 1 recovery tech swim on a Monday. It is 0 impact, zone 1, all technique. And then I do usually 1 hard swim workout per week. And I think the reason that this has worked for me is because I've been doing, number 1, really good strength training. And number 2, there have been other years where I've just really prioritized the swim. So years where we've been in the pool for 4 times a week, hitting 15,000 yards or something. Cannot imagine that now, but that was money in the bank for this moment where I can say, okay, I don't need to do an Ironman distance swim and this is working. So again, I think you need to earn that to an extent. Maybe if you're a brand new swimmer, it can be useful to get in more times a week. We've talked about, the power of 5X, doing 2 weeks of I'm going to get in the pool 5 times a week. You really will see some huge gains with that. But I think for me, this lesson was just I'm tapping into what I like. I'm maintaining some joy and balance because I kind of usually dread it when I'm going into the pool. And then I also was just being strategic about the specific demands of my race. Because if I want to have the fastest race, I'm going to spend the most time building what I need for a 95-mile bike and a 8-mile run that has 4,200 feet of elevation gain, not for a swim that's probably going to take me like 30 to 40 minutes. Yeah.
No, I think this is a super smart play. And like you said, I want to emphasize, you've earned that. You've spent a lot of time in the pool over the last, 6-7 years. And like you say, if you're a new swimmer, sure, you got to put in those years, right, of 3-4 times per week. And eventually it will pay off. But yeah, good job. I mean, it's just fun to look back and say, it's money in the bank and you can really fall back on that. And now you have this technique sort of down. You can kind of do minimum effective dose probably for many years, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so too. And I think sometimes you need to think about, if we think about run training, for example, minimum effective dose can be lower than you think. There's been some really cool athletes that have come out. I don't know if you're familiar with Parker Balby, who's this NCAA track runner who has the fastest 5K, the fastest 10K. She's absolutely unstoppable. And she runs twice a week because she's been injury prone in the past. She does 10 to 20 miles maybe, and then does a ton of cross training. And she is blasting through every NCAA running record that there is. So at the end of the day, everyone needs to figure out what the minimum effective dose is for them. But for me, I am glad that I'm not in the pool more than twice a week.
and your skin doesn't constantly smell like chlorine.
I know, my hair looks so much better. It's awesome. That's why we're here. We're really here for the hair
right
for sure.
Yeah, for the beauty tips, really, honestly.
That's
going to be a new segment of the podcast.
James beauty tips.
Let's go. My gear of the week is going to be a different shampoo. Is what it's going to be.
There you go. I love that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, last training lesson for me. So in the last year, and I think it's relevant to both of us, I have switched up kind of how we've done training and coaching together. So it's been awesome. We've worked together for a really, really long time. And I have learned pretty much everything I know about endurance sports from you, Jim, which I'm so, so grateful for. But I think we decided that this was such a big year for the Endurance Drive in terms of building the business. And that was really our joint focus, that I think it was a lot to also do that and do this coach athlete thing. So I've pivoted a little bit more into kind of doing my own programming. I work very closely with a strength trainer and run coach who kind of oversees all of that. I work with a physical therapist in person who's also affiliated with this coach. And really the plan that I'm making uses the majority of framework and principles that you and I have used together over the years. And I think this works because then you and me can kind of channel all our energy into building the business and focusing on the podcast, as well as still building out our strategy and workout library together. And I think it's interesting because, like, at the end of the day, mentorship really is a journey. And I love that when we started out, I knew literally nothing and you knew all the things. And then you taught me all the things. And now we kind of both know things and we're learning things and we're both kind of moving through that process. But yeah, I think it's just like great to be transparent about that. And it's great that I know that if I'm like, I'm not really sure about something, we've got this podcast, I know how to find you, and we can still kind of build that knowledge together. But it's cool for both of us to kind of, I think, expand our skills in both coaching and training together and on our own as well.
Yeah, absolutely too. And it becomes no surprise that everybody who knows you that you consume a lot of information and can synthesize it and then really sort of add a ton of value. So you've learned so much and surpassed me in many, many ways as well on this journey. So this is sort of jumping ahead a little bit to the podcast part, but one of the things I love about this podcast is actually listening to the things that you say, because I'm listening to, what is Katie saying that I don't know, which is often quite a bit. So
Well, it's fun for me too. And I think, we learn from each other all the time. And this podcast, again, jumping ahead, is just a vehicle for learning. So we'll keep at it. But yeah, it's been fun.
And my other comment is just a general comment, like a coach's ultimate job really is to train their athletes so they're not necessary, which seems kind of weird and seems a little bit counterintuitive. But you really just want your athletes to be able to make their own decisions in the short and long term, especially like with remote coaching. But even if you're in-person coaching, you just want to, provide the principles and the tactics and the strategies. And so that when people leave, for example, like not everybody is being coached by the Endurance Drive forever, but when you leave, you say, you have these principles, you know the tools, you know what to do. And also what I find exciting is I encourage people like, hey, you've learned a bunch of stuff from us at the Endurance Drive. Like, you can go teach this stuff to other people as well too. And I think it's like, because, we didn't come up with this stuff, we just sort of we pick it up along the way. We've learned it over many, many years. And we're sort of a conduit, right? We're a link to the past, to these other coaches. And so I just find it super exciting when people take these principles and our approach and apply it, for themselves outside of the context of the Endurance Drive and hopefully to other people. Like I see a number of athletes who are training, so they're doing a 70.3 and a bunch of people in their office are also doing a 70.3. And I'm always encouraging them, like, tell them about like the workouts that you're doing and have them do some of the same bricks that you're doing. Like, go for it. Like, we want to share this information with everybody.
Yeah. And I think we can think about coaching as something that's a little bit infectious. Like, you taught me how to coach and now I have taught other people how to coach. I coach Kevin. Now Kevin is coaching and it moves in this channel. That's really, really cool. I have many athletes who are like, my sister's doing a half marathon and I made her a plan that was based on the workouts from here. So I think there's tons of coaches and there's tons of athletes to go around. And it's not like, we can only ever guard this knowledge. It's really, really here to share. So if you've ever been interested in coaching, you should do it. Like, that's the take home here. And that can be as simple as your cousin is doing a race that you might know a little bit about and you help them and you make a Google spreadsheet. And that's the way that you do it. And I think that's how everyone gets started.
Yeah, I think it's so important too that I think one of the things that just reflecting back on this podcast and sort of like what the culture of the Endurance Drive is, and I feel like we just have this abundance mindset at the Endurance Drive that there's, like you said, there's plenty of clients to go around and there's so many people out there doing, athletics that spread the knowledge, if you can.
100%. Okay, so those are my training lessons. I have a feeling this is going to be a long episode, but Jim, let's do your training lessons and then we'll do coaching and then we'll do podcasting.
Okay. All right. So my training lesson. So this one probably comes as no surprise, but I'm calling this one. So we usually talk about zone 2 as like the thing, but it turns out there's 2 other zones below that. Zone 0 and Zone 1. And the title of this is Zone 0 and Zone 1 are legit. So yeah, so with this leg injury, I'm just doing tons of like just very, very light activity to build back into fitness. And while sometimes it doesn't feel like, maybe I'm pedaling along at heart rate, 105 or 110, it maybe doesn't feel like real training, but what I'm finding is that it's accumulating quickly and it is starting to make a significant impact, even just over just a few weeks. And like the last weekend, I had one workout where I was like, wait, my watts have really jumped up and my heart rate's really good. And all I've really done is just kind of paddle around a little bit on my snow bike at Zone 0, Zone 1. So what's going on here? So anyway, I just want to encourage folks to say you don't have to always be in Zone 2. It can be a light social bike with your family or your dog. It can be like a brisk walk with family and friends, or just gonna be like regularly walking throughout the day and especially after meals to help regulate insulin, or just something like Katie, you do like a tech swim, and I've been doing some swimming as well, just snorkel only, all technique focus. And again, it doesn't always feel like training, but it actually is training.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think we underestimate how much mitochondria we can probably build in those lower zones and just staying active in general, like literally things like doing housework or gardening or whatever it is. All of that does contribute to this overall base building. So I think that as soon as you're totally healed up, you're going to be smashing threshold intervals higher than you even were before, because when else would you do such a big Zone 0, Zone 1 build, right?
Well, we'll see. Where everybody's in experiment of one, right? So and this leads to my next one, which is like, so leading into this injury, I had just been doing tons of biking. And I don't want to say had big fitness, but I certainly was pretty fit before this injury. And so I'm just reminded that, just big bike volume and just time in the saddle really just forms this foundation for fitness. And I see this a lot with some of our newer athletes, is that just haven't spent a lot of time in the saddle. But when they start to spend more time in the saddle, start getting more and more experience on their bike, I just feel like their big fitness is sort of starting to come through. So it's just not really a new insight for me this year, but I think we've seen this a lot in the past. But I just sort of reminded that a lot of time in the saddle, a lot of time on the bike, you just really build this foundation for fitness, which is great obviously for triathlon, but it could be for, mountain running or running or any other sport.
Yeah, absolutely. It builds huge durability without impact, which is the best thing we can ask for. It's so much better to spend 12 hours on the bike than 12 hours running, because you will get injured if you do that.
Yeah, I've heard that 12 hours is like a recovery week. So
if it's on a road bike, it's a recovery week, obviously.
It's totally, exactly.
All right, next one. This is a big one.
Okay, this next one's a big one. Yeah, very personal, but for this year, so training. So, for I think a lot of us, and for me, like for many years, I was primarily managing my mental health through physical activity. And in many ways, that's still the case. But, physical activity can be a great way to manage like that surface stress and like refresh the body and mind. I think that's why we do a lot of this. But I just realized like this year, like I wanted to go deeper, make a deeper change in like my thought patterns and behaviors and worldviews. And so with the help of a professional, I've started to work on unlocking and revealing my deeper inside. So instead of managing stress and mental health acutely through workouts, therapy has been a better tool for a long-term sustainable change. And I'll say it's not always fun to dig deep down there, but I feel like it's been well worth the effort. And I've seen a number of my athletes who have been taking sort of the same journey this year, some of it through the Dr. Justin Ross program that we have as in Training Peaks. And I'm just sort of amazed by their growth and their insights and their enthusiastic mental energy. And so it's just exciting that people are breaking through both physically and mentally.
I love this so much. And thank you so much for sharing, because I feel like this is not something that everyone is open about on like an endurance-based podcast, but we know that this physical and mental go so hand in hand, even if it's not about figuring out how to make exercise work or not work for managing mental health. I think we are all people with minds, and therefore we need mental health support. So huge proponent of therapy as well. I feel like that's my gear pick of the week, is like, go to therapy if you're going to spend money on something.
That's perfect. Yes. That's the challenge of the week and the gear pick of the week, right?
Yeah. Double header on that. But yeah, that has definitely been a huge game changer for me. And I think we encourage all of our athletes to check it out. If you hadn't, it can be scary, but it's not something that should be stigmatized. It's something that can just really enhance your whole quality of life for sure. All right. That's training lessons. Should we do coaching lessons? We're coaches, so I feel like that's relevant.
Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is I participated in a pretty cool program this spring called the Coaches Collective. And this is a program that is run by this woman, Dr. Lara Pence. She's a clinical psychologist who worked with a lot of really high profile athletes. And basically, she was interested in providing a training for coaches that gives you the tools to really provide psychological support from a coaching lens. So like, I don't have a degree in clinical psychology. And sometimes as a coach, I encounter athletes who are going through really serious things like anxiety or depression or eating disorders or trauma or grief, you name it. And she's created this program that basically gives you the baseline of skills that you need to at least know how to support as a coach. Now, I'm not a substitute for a therapist. I'm not a substitute for any of these things. But again, coaches are often the first line of defense. So that was an amazing program. Could probably spend a whole podcast talking about that. But one thing that was really cool that we did in this program was identifying our coaching values. And something cool that we learned about values was that when there's values alignment, so when your actions match your values, you have a lot of life harmony, your mental health is way better, everything is great. When there's a mismatch between what you're doing and your values, that's where things get really, really messy. And so sitting down and identifying what are my values as a coach has created a lot of harmony with me thinking about how I want to interact with my athletes and how, okay, am I doing something that's not in alignment with my values? How can I then change that? So I'm going to share my values. It was a very arduous process to choose because we had a list of like 100 and then we had to narrow it down to 7 and then we had to narrow it down to 4. And that was really hard because I'm like, oh my gosh, I have 25 values. But I said that mine were number 1, empathy, number 2, communication, number 3, attention to detail, and number 4, enthusiasm. So again, could spend a whole podcast talking about each of these values and what they mean to me. But it's been really cool kind of as I go through every Training Peaks comment, having in the back of my mind, like, am I showing some enthusiasm? I'm big about my athletes know, like all caps, 6 exclamation points, crushed it. I'll say something like that for really big workouts, for example. Or am I responding with empathy? You know, someone went way over the workout that they were supposed to do, but they were just super stressed. They needed to let it out. Like, how do I show empathy in doing that? Or someone hasn't reached out in a little while and I'm worried about them. How am I going to communicate? So the idea here is just like identifying coaching values has been really powerful. And it's something that I'm glad that I did and hope to kind of continue to do because values can evolve over time. And then my final point is that I think my coaching values actually do match my life values in a pretty big way. And that helps with the alignment too. Like I like to think I can be a pretty enthusiastic person. I care about attention to detail and like to show empathy, et cetera, in my daily life. So yeah, this has just given me a lot of clarity and I'm super excited about it.
Yeah, what a cool activity just to go from 100 to 4. That sounds sort of stressful actually, but I think you're knowing you it's spot on. And one thing I always think about like this mental models, like sometimes when I feel like stressed out or like I feel a little bit lost, I'm like, okay, wait, what are my values? What am I like falling back on that foundation, right? And saying, oh, okay, I'm grounded in these things. And therefore, these decisions or these communications or whatever you're talking to athletes, like just becomes easier because I've returned back to that foundation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we actually encourage athletes to think about their values as well. I had some of my athletes go through a values identifying exercise where if, for example, your values are community, well, don't do all your workouts by yourself. Let's make sure there's a master's swim in there. Or if it's joy, like how are we going to do some play type fun workouts and do Strava segments as intervals, all of that. So we would say this isn't just for coaches, this is for humans, and this is for athletes as well. So my next one here, coaching lesson on managing athlete load. So I do a lot of things. I wear a lot of hats. I often maybe spread myself a little bit thin, but I think this year has been a good exercise in figuring out what is the right load of athletes where I can still give the experience that I want for coaching. So I would say I maxed out this year at about 20 athletes at one given time. And I found that 20 sweet spot was a good place for me where I was excited about, the amount of money I was making from coaching was sustainable for what I needed in relation to other job stuff that I was doing. But more importantly, that was where I was able to provide that person first type of thing where in my head, without having to look at notes or anything, I just knew like, okay, so-and-so's sick right now. We've got to make some changes or so-and-so's nursing a calf thing that I'm worried about. And I think if I did this full time, which is maybe in the cards for me in the future, I could certainly take more athletes. But we see a lot of coaches will move to a model where they're like, oh, I just make training plans. I don't know any of my athletes. And there's no longer this person first thing. And for me, I think one of my big values as I kind of expand my coaching platform and business through the Endurance Drive is that I want to be able to give the same type of service to my athletes as I can give right now. And if there's ever a mismatch with that, then something has to change. And you can change the levers on whether it's pricing or how much in-person stuff you're doing or whatever. But I want people to know that if something goes wrong, they can reach me and I'm going to know what's going on and know them as a person. So that was a valuable insight for me.
We talk about this a lot is that coaching just doesn't scale well, shall we say. So doing, typical business or, revenue projection models. It doesn't really fit into that. Like it's, like you say, it's all about the relationship and this one-to-one relationship. And that just doesn't really scale. So in terms of a business-wise, like, I'm not sure coaching's, it's a good business, but like, it's not like some great business, shall we say. You do it for so many other reasons than, I guess, the business aspect of it.
Absolutely. And I think at the end of the day, like waking up every day and saying, I love what I do is worth the fact that it doesn't make the most money of any job in the world. And that is okay. Like, I feel so grateful that it doesn't really ever feel like work when we're doing coaching stuff because I'm just so excited about it. So that's something to be really grateful for. And on that, actually, my next lesson is all about just gratitude for what coaching gives you. And I think especially this year, but I've noticed this for probably all the 5 or 6 years that I've been coaching, is that a coach-athlete relationship can be a very close relationship and a pretty intimate one and a pretty vulnerable one because, you're programming things that people are going to do every day. And you often are one of the first people to find out when they're going through some pretty serious stuff, whether it's grief, trauma, heartbreak, loss, illness, injury. The coach usually needs to know in order to best support that athlete when they might not even be looping in some of their close friends, for example. And this is something that I'm always just aware is a really huge privilege that I want to take really, really seriously. I think I see it as a privilege because it goes back to that values alignment. So things like communication and empathy. But at the end of the day, like being a coach is about so much more than just giving people their tempo run. That just doesn't really matter at the end of the day. And I think the part that we probably both appreciate the most is getting to know people and then helping them on their life journeys, which does involve training and athletic things. But at the end of the day, like you're a pretty big partner in life, which is really, really cool.
Yeah, like you say, it's such a privilege to get to know people at such a deep level. And I don't know if that's something that I really understood coming into coaching. But as soon as you get into coaching, you realize, oh my gosh, this is a deep relationship. And like you say, you're often the front line for things that come up that maybe they haven't even told anybody else about yet. And anyway, yeah, I guess it's just a huge privilege. And I feel the same. I'm just super grateful to be able to do this job.
Absolutely. Okay. And last one here. I feel like this is a coaching insight, but it's also a training insight. And I say it on every podcast, but I'm going to say it again. Fueling 70 to 90 grams of carbs per hour is magic. So the reason that this is a big coaching lesson is that it's just been awesome. I've given my athletes a lot more guidance this year with literal notes in Training Peaks, just like part of their race plan or their workout plan about how to fuel. And athletes have been crushing it like never before because I think we're just tapping into how amazing this high carb fueling is. So if you're not on the train, get on the train because that is the best way to enhance your performance. And it's been awesome to see it from both the coaching and the training side.
Yeah, I think if I would just have to pick like one thing that's really happened the most this year with my athletes, I'd say it's definitely the fueling and the breakthroughs that's brought. I think in the past we've done okay with it, but like you say, like the constant messaging on the podcast and Training Peaks, and I've just seen so many comments this year like, oh my God, I just crushed this race sim. And I just sort of, as a coach, I'm sort of used to like being like, maybe the first 1 or 2 race sims don't go so well. And this year it's like, wow, you guys crushed the race sim like right from the beginning. Why? Because you ate. So it's so super cool to see. Good job, guys.
Absolutely. All right, Jim, your coaching lessons.
All right. Well, this is sort of dovetails into one of my other lessons above, but mental side of training is huge. So yeah, in parallel with my own personal mental training journey, I've really become this year fascinated with sports and mental training. In the past, it's been about building out the training libraries, Zwift workouts, collecting data and knowledge from my mentors. And yeah, sure, that's an integral and necessary step in becoming a coach, knowing all those things. And part of being a coach is loving the data and, why is a workout effective and how do I apply those workouts across a wide spectrum of athletes? But at the end of the day, that's sort of just one part of the equation. So this year I've spent more time trying to understand the mental side of training more. And I just feel like I've just started this journey. So I don't really feel like I'm an expert at all. I feel like I'm just scratching the surface, but it's been a fun journey. And I hope that I can bring more value to my athletes with understanding more about the mental side of training.
No, I completely agree with that, Jim. I think the mental side of training has been a huge thing for me with my athletes this year, giving them that mental training template and then helping them go through it. I feel like I'm learning stuff for me as an athlete and as a coach as well. So I'm so glad that we've prioritized that this year.
Yeah. My second one here is you mentioned it above, which is like always searching for that minimum effective dose. And, every athlete is super busy with work and family and community. And I'm just always impressed that anybody can get any training done actually with so much that's going on. But, time is so precious and it's so limited. And so as a coach, I'm just trying to find like, what's the minimum we have to do in order to get a stimulus that is appropriate for their training and their race goals. And so often I'm thinking about like less is more. And we talked about this in the podcast, like, holding people back. But, really, what is that a minimum effective dose? And it doesn't have to always be a ton of hours to get faster, whether it's swim, bike, or run.
It could be 2 swims a week, believe it or not.
As long as you're doing 12 hours on the bike, it's fine.
On the road bike.
Yes.
All right, next insight.
My third one here is, I think, wow, this year is I just have like the greatest variety of athletes this year. I think in years past, I've sort of clumped together a little bit. But this year, yeah, tons of variety, which is both challenging and exciting. And for me, it just means I have to really dig into everyone's plan to meet them where they are and to be really flexible, like on a weekly basis. And I know we don't plug, us and the endurance drive that much, but I do want to plug our coaching staff because I think we are just really extremely knowledgeable and agile and adaptable. And we're just not locked into one plan and one approach. It's because we have a lot of experience with levels of athletes and training and race distances. And so we have this desire and ability to work with, everybody individually. So I think that's something that really, like, I know other coaches in other places probably do, but I think we're just particularly really good at what we do here. And that's meeting people where they are.
Yeah, and I think we see that there's no one-size-fits-all plan, even if we have very similar athletes doing the exact same race. Like between the two of us, I think we had 8 or 9 athletes at 70.3 Western Mass, and no 2 plans were identical for that race because everybody's different. So even if, you're doing one of our most common distances or types of races, you're still going to get that individualized attention. And you have a lot of different versions of doing it across our coaches that all share these principles, but are there for the person first, 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. My next one is that play is super important. And I know we've talked about this again and again and again, but I think this year more than any other year, I've been encouraging athletes to join groups to train together. And those workouts may not be a perfect fit for Zone 2, but they're a perfect fit for community and joy. So there's a trade-off sometimes, but I think in the past I've sort of poo-pooed a little bit some of these group workouts, and it's like, oh, it's Zone 2. But again, back to our other point of just being flexible, I'm really saying this year more and more to folks, like, go out and find a friend or join the group ride or join the group run. And I don't really care what the workout is. You'll plug the workout in after you get back from Training Peaks, and then I can kind of see what you guys did. And then we can sort of work the week around like what you guys did at the track this week. And so that's just a difference that I've made this year with my coaching.
I love that. And I think, you and I, Jim, we've done so much training together and with large groups that I think we're just used to having that community element. And this year I've been mostly based in Boston. I've had a lot of work travel and I have done a lot more training by myself. And I would say that is a recipe, if you do it for too long, to really kind of burn out and just not enjoy what you're doing anymore. So once I've been starting to feel that, like, oh God, I do not want to go out for my 4-hour ride, that is a really good cue for me to say, all right, I got to call someone who's in my network and say, we're doing this together. And then before you know it, you're having a great time. But I have learned that it's not great to spend like 16 hours a week of training by myself inside of my head. Like, that's just not an awesome place to be most of the time. And if you spend it with someone else, then you're not going to be in that place. So highly, highly recommend.
Absolutely. And my last one here is, and this is a little bit of a plug for the Endurance Drive, but the Endurance Drive, we have this Endurance Drive Live, and it's a twice monthly Zoom call with all the coaches, and all the athletes are invited. And this is a great opportunity to learn from other coaches and athletes. And for me, it's really informative to hear a variety of training and racing tactics and strategies from the other coaches, from the other athletes. And so there's there's a brain trust of coaching and racing knowledge on these calls. So, again, I'm not really here to plug the Endurance Drive, but if you're not being trained by us, you really should be.
Yeah, I love those calls too. And it's great to know that it's often the athletes that are giving us as much information as we're sharing as coaches, because everyone's picked up little insights here and there. So, you and me, we can riff on insights all day long, but having a fresh perspective with those calls, it's just so much fun. All right. So we made it to this new segment. Last time that we started the podcast and we did lessons, we did not do podcasting lessons, but I feel like I have a lot to say about this. And I think you do too, because it has been such a big change from how we've approached everything with the Endurance Drive recently. And I would say that change has been 100% for the better. So the first lesson that I wanted to share is sort of this idea of vulnerability. And I think on this podcast, even on this episode, but on a lot of episodes, we will get a little bit vulnerable. And I think I've learned that is something that's really powerful. It's scary, but it inspires other people to be vulnerable. And it does, at the end of the day, kind of feel good for your own personal healing process or whatever that is. So you're there to help other people, but if you can get something out, I think that's really, really great too. And I think one of the most gratifying things that has happened to me on this podcast is having people reach out and say, wow, I really, really resonated with what you said there. And I didn't realize that you thought about something in that way too. that's been probably the most rewarding thing that has come out of the podcast for me. So it's scary, but going to try to keep being vulnerable and keeping it real, because I do think there's a ton of power in doing that.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think, part of my podcast lessons here is looking at your podcast lessons and saying, absolutely, 100%.
Totally.
So that's all I can say about that one. Yes.
Next one here. So I wouldn't say that this is like a con if vulnerability is a pro, but something I have been aware of is sort of being a little bit more in the public eye. And again, our podcast is not famous enough that we have a million people that are hearing our voices. Although who knows, maybe we'll get there if we can get that Nature's Bakery sponsorship. But I think sometimes, like, I was having dinner with a friend recently who I hadn't seen in months, and she's like, "Oh yeah, I feel totally caught up on your life." And I was like, "What?" She's like, "Yeah, I listen to you every single week in my car." And that idea of having people be caught up on your life and you're not necessarily caught up on their life, you people talk about parasocial relationships or whatever. It is just a little bit different. And I can't really conceptualize like how many people have my voice in their car or on their run in a given week, even if we can see the raw listener numbers. So all this is to say is sometimes I feel like I now spend a little bit more time thinking about how I appear, like on Strava or Instagram. And if I'm having a really bad day, do I need to be authentic about that? Or, it's always just a balance of figuring out what that is going to look like. And then I think I also have some inevitable, probably self-inflicted pressures to feel like I should be perfect, but also authentic and also be palatable and all those different things. And so as I zoom out, I'm like, people probably don't care that much. I'm sure I think a lot more about what other people are thinking about me. But, on the spirit of authenticity and vulnerability, this is something I sometimes struggle a little bit with. And I think we can always show up and just do the best that we can and share coaching and training things that we've picked up, but I'm just still trying to navigate what that's like having this new audience that we didn't have before.
Yeah, it's super tricky, right? Because I remember thinking about like the early Facebook, and I used to say to people like, "Oh, it's a really fun way to keep up with people's lives." But Facebook, it's just a little, it's like pictures here and there, maybe once a week people post up, but you do feel like they're sort of caught up in their life. But this is like social media a little bit on steroids, because we are sharing so much. And so, yeah, it is a tricky balance, and it is a funny thing. And I'll also just apologize for people who have my voice in their ear when they're running. So,
yeah, I know. I don't love listening to my voice back on the podcast either. So that's a lesson, but it is what it is. Okay, last one. This is a warm and fuzzy one. I think the best thing about this podcast so far has been building this new community. It's not just our athletes anymore. And I feel very attached to our listeners, even some of which I don't know who they are, and just super grateful that people actually think we have something useful to say and want to listen. It really makes my day when people reach out and say they love the podcast, or just when our athletes mention these principles or tips or tricks that I mentioned in passing at minute 37 of episode 17. And they just know that's part of the way that they think about things. So I really appreciate that, and want to give a special shout out to like the 20-ish people that listen to new episodes that drop before 6 a.m. on a given Thursday. I always wake up and look at it. And I'm like, who listened to this at 5 a.m? Shout out to Laura Faye. But in general, it's awesome to see that. And yeah, just love this community so much.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, it's the same thing here. The community's just been amazing. And I think, time is like the most precious gift. And just to realize that there's a bunch of people out there who are using their time to actually listen to the things that we have to say. And so I so much appreciate that. So it leads into my podcasting lesson. So again, everything you've said, of course, yes, I feel the exact same way. One thing I have found is that podcasting for me has just been a great way to organize my thoughts on a daily and weekly basis. And so that I find myself thinking about something, and I'll run to my phone and I'll write something down, and I'll say, "Oh, this pertains to coaching," or I can use this on the podcast. And so it's just fun. I always have the notes application running on either my iPhone or my laptop or a desktop, and there's always typing something in. So, and I just found it's easier than a blog post, and obviously this podcast has a lot more reach, and it just seems much more effective for passing along our training principles and our strategies and tactics than a blog post. So, and I just feel like I'm a much better coach for having to organize my thoughts on a daily basis. It's easy to sort of think about these things, but then for me, I just kind of forget. These ideas just sort of waft away, and now I actually have a centralized place to actually put all these things on the podcast and in our podcast notes. So, yeah, I think that's my only addition, I think, to what you said.
No, I love that. And I'll tell you a secret. So something that happens to me is I feel like I get my best coaching and training insights while I'm on the bike for whatever reason, or sometimes on a run. And I'll be out there and I'm like, oh, I can't really pull up the notes app right now and write this down. So I'll spend time thinking of some type of mnemonic device that can help me remember the 3 insights that I came up with. So it'll be like, okay, there was one about wetsuits, that's W. And then there was one about off the bike, that's O. And then there was another one about like water safety, and it's wow. And then I'll get off the bike and be like, wow, wow, wow. Okay, what did I have? And I'll write it down. So it's just funny that that's kind of the creative process. But I think we've talked about this too. A lesson is that this whole thing is so creative. It's a creative outlet. And I'm not really someone who like paints or draws, or I love people who have creative outlets like that. But this is my number one creative outlet right now. And it's just so cool to get to do it for something that really helps people.
Yeah, it's just it's a real honor to be able to do this with you, and just to, like I said, to reach out to our community and then have our community feedback. And so every time we get that feedback, I'm like, oh my gosh, we should just keep going because this is so amazing and for everybody.
And speaking of which, we are linking our podcast feedback form in the show notes. So if you have questions or topic ideas, or you just want to drop us a note, please hop in there and feel free to fill it out. And while you're at it, if you could give us a rating or review, we would really appreciate that, because that is the one thing that helps us grow the podcast. We don't really get paid to do this. And I just edit it and we do audio engineering, and that's how it works. So a review or a rating would mean a ton. But before we wrap up, I do think we've got to do our regular ending segment. So Jim, we got a couple of good listener questions this week, again, from that feedback form. So you should use it. I'm going to read the first one. It says, hi, I have a question about what the difference is between logging your power over a swim, bike, run, workout versus logging heart rate. Why do some people use one or the other? Is it beneficial to use both? And how do you usually do that for each sport? What do you prefer? Can a Garmin watch do this? So maybe we can break this down: swim, bike, run. My first instinct is that power and heart rate are both not that useful for swimming at all. So I wouldn't really pay attention to them. I mean, your watch might pick up some type of swim heart rate, but we are focusing mostly on technique when it comes to swimming, as well as some type of pace. So you can use the pace clock. But for heart rate and power, I would ignore that pretty much entirely for swim.
Yep. Don't be the triathlete wearing your heart rate strap in the pool.
Nope. Jim, talk to us about bike power versus heart rate.
Yeah. So, I mean, some athletes have a power meter, and certainly if you do have a power meter, we will use that mostly. But also, if you don't have one, we will use heart rate. So watts is preferred. The heart rate can lag a little bit with biking, but that will certainly work fine as well too. And actually something I've been doing sort of coming back from this injury is I've been looking at watts, and I've been actually looking at heart rate as well, and kind of using both of them. So really, it just really depends on what resources the athlete has, whether we use watts or heart rate.
Totally. Yeah. And for racing, we often will defer a little bit more to heart rate, especially if it's hot, because that can be a useful race strategy, even if we train mostly with power. So running, the last one here, it's funny because many Garmins now do capture run power, but that's not something I've really used too much as a relevant metric. I'm focusing more on heart rate and pace there. Although if anyone knows anything about run power and wants to drop us a note, we're always curious to hear about it. I think maybe one useful metric there is like it could account better for things like wind or things like hills or whatever. But at the end of the day, heart rate is pretty useful for the run. And so we're going to defer to that.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. Run for heart and pace. And yeah, there is, I think we'll have a discussion in other podcasts about the run power, because it always defaults to that. And there are very specific cases where that's helpful. But for, I think, 99% of our athletes, it's heart rate and pace.
All right. Next question here. What are those fancy cooling headbands that pros are wearing during races, and should I wear them? So if you have not seen these, at a lot of Ironman races, I've seen pros wearing this thing that looks a little bit like a crown. And honestly, I thought it was like some type of Red Bull marketing item that looked like a crown at first. Like it was something that was just supposed to make those triathletes seem better than everyone else. But it turns out that these are, I believe, graphite-based cooling headbands. And one of our listeners was asking if it's worth trying to get one. And my answer is probably not. Again, we've talked about this before, but professional triathletes are trying to get from 99.98% to 99.99%. And most of our athletes are trying to get from 50 or 75% to 99%. So let's focus on things like sleep, nutrition, hitting your green boxes and training peaks for the most part. And that will get you a lot of the way there. But those headbands probably are not going to make a huge difference as long as you're putting ice on yourself, dumping cold water, and otherwise staying cool.
I think next year, when I start a race, I'm going to buy one like a King's Crown and put it on for the money. And I'll be like, and I'll run around going, I am so cool. I am amazingly cool. Look at my headband. A big gold thing on top. Like, this is amazing.
Yep. That's perfect. Yeah. I mean, people do battle braids, people do sparkles, all of that, whatever makes you feel fast. That's what matters. All right. Last question here. I love this question. We've pushed it a couple episodes because we've just been super busy with our podcasting, but someone asked us, what is your process as a coach? So how do you make a plan and take into account all of the individual details of a person's life to best support their training. And this question actually came up. I had a bunch of Boston female athletes over a couple of weeks ago, and a group of them that were all doing the exact same race remarked that they have compared notes and have had very different training plans. And they're like, how am I actually sitting down and doing that and keeping track of those individual variables? And I think it's interesting because we talk about having principles. We know what general principles guide the training. But for me, part of coaching is so much getting to know the person that I really do just kind of have information about them in my head about what their strengths are and their weaknesses are and how they think about training mentally. And then I sit down and I use the principles to best drag workouts from our library that align with where that person is at. And that's why it is important to me to have a small-ish group of athletes, because I feel like as that number goes up, it's hard to keep track of all those details. And I wouldn't ever want to just forget that someone's not a good swimmer or whatever it is. I need to just know that information at the top of my head. So yeah, I kind of blend those principles with the one-on-one communication that I've gained from people. And so far, so good, I would say, but always looking to continue to innovate.
Yeah, this is one of the best questions we've received. And so, yeah, the way I look at it, like, coaching is an art and a science. And so, like you say, as coaches, we have dozens of tactics and strategies, and we have hundreds of workouts in our workout library to get people fit. But each individual has a unique capacity, skill set, background, physiology, race goals, etc. So holding all these variables, we sort of ground in our training principles, and then use all of our acquired knowledge and tactics and strategies to craft an individual plan. And so I like to say, like, plans are like a Mozart composition, like changes to the melody, rhythm, harmony, counterpoint, timbre, orchestration, but the theme of the song, or in our case, the training principles, remains central.
That's beautiful. I feel like we should put that in a quote and put it on our website. So if anyone, after listening to this podcast, the Prison website has not yet signed with the Endurance Drive, they will do it with that quote. Awesome. Well, I guess we get to finish now with our gear pick of the week, which is our favorite segment. As we know, it's been a lot of lessons and a lot of questions. And so we're going to finish up with that. I am someone who travels a ton, and I am actually going to recommend my go-to travel bag, which sometimes has triathlon gear in it and sometimes it doesn't. So I really like the Patagonia Black Hole 55-liter duffel bag. It's a great duffel bag because I swear it is indestructible. You can throw it on the ground, you can throw it out the plane, it'll be completely fine. And it has backpack straps. So what I'll usually do is wear that on my back, wear a regular backpack on the front. I am carrying a lot of weight, but now that I've been strength training, it's no problem for me to walk around with like 50 pounds on my back just walking around, and you can fit it in a carry-on for a plane. So that's really, really nice. And I've taken this thing all over the world. So highly recommend that duffel bag, and could be a good transition bag as well.
So to clarify, should I ask the pilot on my next flight if I can throw my bag out the window?
Just to test. It's quality control purposes. Yeah.
We're just gonna open up the emergency exit just to see if it works, and throw my bag out, and somebody in Cleveland will retrieve it. Hey, listen, I've got a tag on it, so they're gonna return it to me.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's the challenge of the week, is actually throw this duffel bag out the window.
At 35,000 feet. Yes.
All right, Jim, your pick of the week.
Okay, my pick of the week is, I'm looking forward to getting back and doing a little hiking, hopefully in about a month here. And so my pick of the week this week is the Solomon 12-liter pack. We'll put a link to it, but that's the pack that both of us use. Great for summertime and fall time, and you can even extend it out for day trips in the wintertime.
Absolutely. This is the best pack in the entire world. We have searched high and low for a better pack and have not found one. So highly, highly recommend as well. That brings us to the end. This has been such a fun one to record. And I feel like, if we ever need a new episode idea, we can just maybe do insights. Although if folks hated this episode, please let us know. But yeah, thank you so much. The biggest thing that should shine through here is thank you so much to our community for sticking with us for 6 months. And hopefully we'll do another 60 months. We'll see how this all goes. But it's been really fun, and we're just super, super grateful. So thanks for listening.
Thanks, folks. We'll see you later.